Okay, so this is Professor Orr. It's now 5:25 Central Time. Um, my office hour started at 6:15, but I was just giving a few extra minutes for any students to show up. So far, no one has shown up. So since no one's here to ask any questions or anything, what I will do is just cover something related to the topics that you're covering in the course this week. And if anyone does join in for the office hour, then if they have any questions or anything, I'll pause what I'm going over or doing and address any questions they may have. So, of course, we're in week 2. What I have pulled up here on the screen is the Unit 2 assignment. Excuse me. I think overall everyone did a good job in week 1 on the assignment. I do want to just reiterate that don't follow the instructions that you see directly here in Canvas. Be sure to open up the lab guide and use that lab guide to paste your screenshots into, and also be sure to use the lab guide with the examples, which I'm going to open up here, because as you can see here, it does have, it shows you exactly what your screenshot should look like. So as much as possible, make sure that your screenshots match the examples that are provided. If your screenshot turns out to be a little different, that's okay, as long as I can see what I need to see in order, to know that, that you successfully completed that part of the lab activity. So, it's best just to make sure your screenshots match the examples, because if they do, then you don't have any problem. So don't forget about that. You were assigned to read Chapter 2 last week, but you were not assigned the activities in Chapter 2. Now this week you are. You've been assigned the activities for Chapters 2 and 3. And of course, it's not all the activities, but it's the ones that you see listed in the week 2 lab guide. So looking at our textbook, just so that we can kind of take a look here what you're studying at this point. So Chapter 2 was all about managing organizational units and Active Directory accounts, and now Chapter 3 is on user and service account configuration. And so looking at this chapter, you can see you start out with an overview on that topic. Then your textbook gets into configuring account policies. Also, the next section there is configuring password settings. Then managing service accounts, and that's pretty much all that's covered in this chapter. Starting here at the beginning, and obviously I'm not going to read your book to you, but it starts out with just an overview of user accounts and how group policies are related to that. So you just get into some of the basics about group policy. One of the more important items that is addressed in your reading here is the default domain policy. This policy, as it states, it's default, so it's always going to be there, and it's going to apply domain wide. So keep that in mind. The default domain controllers policy, again, another default policy, but this one specifically applies to domain controllers in the domain. So for instance, one thing that you'll learn about is that a normal user cannot log into a domain controller, and that policy is something that is set in the default domain controllers policy. So knowing, or at least having some idea of what's in there can kind of help you if you down the line you know decide that you want to change something, you know, some of the default behavior, and that could be true with the default domain policy as well. You know, you don't have to accept these default policies as they are. You can go in and edit them and change them, but I would caution that you want to be very careful about doing that. Most of the settings that are configured and the policies that are configured, well, I guess I should say most of the, and we'll look at this in a second, most of the computer and user configurations that exist in these policies are pretty standard across the industry, and typically, you know, a lot of these things in here are just good, you know, good practice, you know, kind of a, you know, best practices kind of thing. But you know, so you want to use caution and make sure you know what you're doing and you understand what you're doing if you go in here and edit any of these default policies. But just keep in mind it can be done. I have done it on occasion in the past for different things, you know, so again, it can be done. So, you know, when you go into group policy, basically you have two different sections that you can configure in there, and one is the computer configuration, the other is the user configuration. And just like you would assume, any policy you configure under the computer configuration is going to apply to computer. Any policy that you configure under the user configuration is going to apply to users. Here's a good look at the group policy management editor, and what you do in order to get to the editor is that you go into group policy, you open up group policy, and you can do that using the RSAT tools, which are the remote server administration tools, or you can remote into a domain controller and open up group policy there. And when you open up group policy, what you'll see is a list of the policies that exist. So you'll see those default policies that I talked about previously, and you'll see any other configured policies. And then what they've done to get to this group policy management editor is they have right-clicked on an existing policy and chosen the option to edit it. And so now they're inside the editor. And here you can see under the computer configuration, they've gone into the Windows settings, and specifically they're looking at security settings and the password policy. Looking at this, this looks like the default for the policy setting, if my memory serves me correctly. So as you can see, basically the last 24 passwords are going to be remembered, so that keeps people from recycling passwords too often. Actually, this is not default. 42 days, that's not default. Anyway, you can set a maximum password age, so if you set it at 90 days, then they have to change their password every 90 days. Minimum password age, that would be 1 day. That keeps somebody from bypassing, you know, easily bypassing the first policy setting, because if we didn't have the minimum password age, then they could sit there and change their policy 24 times and go right back to the same one they've been using. Minimum password length is 7 characters. So that means that if when someone changes their password, they have to have at least 7 characters. Password must meet complexity requirements. If that's enabled, then they have to have 3 out of the 4, which is lowercase, uppercase, numbers, and special characters. And then if passwords are going to be stored using reversible encryption, and this is disabled by default. So anyway, I'm not going to go through any of the rest of your reading here. What I want to do at this point is I'm going to go over to NetLab, and I'm going to schedule a lab for myself that I can jump into here real quick and just show you a couple of things. So we'll jump into the Windows Server 2016 lab environment, And just going to take the first available pod here. And I'm going to go ahead and enter my lab. Give it just a minute here to initialize the pod and get all the servers up. I guess while that's doing that, I will get back to the textbook. But as you can see, the rest of this section is just continuing to tell you a little bit more about group policy and some of the basics, and some of the defaults. Let's see. Here's a look at the group policy management window itself, and I referred to that previously. Remember, I mentioned right-clicking on a policy to edit it. Well, this is where you would do that. So when you go into group policy management, first you'll see the forest, and it'll be this whole section will be collapsed, and if it's the first time you've been in there. And then so you can expand all that out and see essentially under this domain, MCSA 2016.local, there's the default domain policy that we looked at and talked about just a little bit ago. There's the default, here's the default domain policy here. This is just a shortcut to it. Here's also the default domain controllers policy. And then this is a new policy that's been set up as an example here, where password policy has been configured. One thing I'll mention about adding policies and setting up new policies and everything, it's a really tricky thing to manage. You want to be as descriptive and specific about your policies as possible. That way they're easier to find. And it's also good, to keep, good notes on what exists as well, documentation on what exists. But you want to be careful. You don't want to create a new group policy for every little thing that you do, because then you're going to end up with a ton of policies in here. And number one, it'll make it difficult to manage. But number two, it'll make group policy processing a lot more time consuming. So when someone logs on to the network and all the policies start getting applied, if you've got 1,000 policies here that have to be applied, that's going to really slow down the login process. Or the person may actually get to the desktop before all the policies have been applied to their computer or user account. So that's definitely a problem. So we don't want to have too many policies here, but at the same time we don't want to have a bunch of different things configured in the same policy. Things that maybe don't that aren't related to each other. For instance, one thing that you might want to do here for all of the workstations on your domain is configure a workstation policy. Inside that workstation policy, you can configure all of the different policy settings that you want to apply to every single workstation, within your domain. And so that way that any policy that's applying to a workstation is going to be configured there. So if you need to change something, add something, whatever, you know where to go to do it. You may have, within that workstation policy, you may have 50, 60 different settings that are being applied, and that's going to get processed a lot faster in that single policy than if you had a separate policy for each and every one of those individual configurations. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's about keeping a good balance when it comes to managing group policy. Getting back to NetLab, as you can see, we're up here. So if we go to the domain controller, server DC1, I'm going to send a Control-Alt-Delete, log in as administrator. Okay, so here's our Server Manager window, and this is where we can easily access all of our tools. So on a domain controller, one of the tools that's going to be available for you is going to be group policy, and right here it is. So I'm just going to open up group policy management here, open up the tool, and just kind of show you, what I have been talking about previously as we were looking through some of Chapter 3 there. So anyway, as you can see, here's my forest, and then the domains inside of the forest, which we only have a single domain. Here is my default domain policy. Here's the default domain controllers policy. Notice when I click on those, it tells me that I've selected a link to a GPO, and that any of the changes that I make here are global to that GPO and will impact all other locations where the GPO is linked. So that's just a general reminder. When you click on a policy, one of the first things that you notice here is the scope tab, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It kind of gives you the scope to which this policy is applied to, and so you'll notice that it's being applied to domain controllers, which is what we would expect for the default domain controller policy. We have security filtering down here, so this would specify which Active Directory groups that this policy is going to apply to, and so this is pretty generic in that it's just applying to the authenticated user, so it's going to apply to everybody. So that's that policy. If we look at the default domain, the default domain policy, you can see here it's applied to the entire domain, which is what we'd expect. And again, kind of generic here, it's applying to authenticated users, which would be basically everything in the domain. If you click on details, this will give you a little more information about when it was created and modified, and that sort of thing. The settings tab is obviously extremely useful because you can expand this and actually see what policies are configured. So here, notice, in the textbook we were looking at the password policy, and at first I told you it was default, but the default settings, but then as I went through I realized, okay, yeah, this was default 24 passwords remembered, but the maximum password age, basically that needs to get set, and you would typically set that at something like 90 days. Some organizations go longer than that, but minimum password age, and then here's the minimum password length, the 7 characters, and then the complexity requirements. And then I mentioned previously that storing the passwords using reversible encryption is disabled by default. So anyway, again, you can just scroll through here and look and see what the default settings are. If you don't like something that's here, you change it, and that's perfectly fine. Just make sure that you understand what you're doing with something like this, because hopefully you do have your GPOs backed up, but if not, if you don't have them backed up, then getting things back to the way they were could be a little bit of a challenge if you mess something up and realize you need to do that. So anyway, down here I'll show you, here are your group policy objects. So this is actually where the policies reside. You notice that these are shortcuts. You can tell that because of the little blue arrow in the left corner of the icon. And when you click on those, it's just taking you to these policy objects. So, so again, you only have these two policies that are here by default. And if you want to create new policies, you can do that in a few different ways. If you know right off where you want your policy to link to, then you can right click on that. In this example, or at this point, I don't have any organizational units, but I tell you what, let's do something about that. Let's open up Active Directory users and computers. And let's see, we'll just create a new OU, and we'll just name it test. Okay, and so there's our OU. And so now if we want to link any group policy objects to this organizational unit, we can easily do that. So I'm going to open up group policy again, and this time you'll see this new organizational unit that I created. Refresh the image here. So there it is. Here's the OU. So if I right click on this OU, and I have the option here to create a GPO in this domain and link it right here. So it'll be linked directly to this OU. So also you'll notice that if I right click on a group policy object, I have the option to edit it here. We looked at that previously as we were going through chapter 3 in your textbook. So right now I can also right click on the OU and link an existing GPO. So if I configure a GPO, maybe at first I haven't thought my way through exactly where I want to link it to, I can go ahead and create the GPO and not link it to anything, and then come back and link it to the appropriate item in Active Directory by using this link an existing GPO item here. So so anyway, that's what you you see here. Notice we don't have any linked group policy objects. If I create a GPO and link it there, I'm just going to name this test as well. I'm not going to use a starter GPO. A starter GPO basically allows you to kind of start at a certain point and then make adjustments, but we're not going to do that one here. So notice I've created my group policy object. Notice that the shortcut shows up here underneath the OU, and then the GPO shows up under the group policy objects. Okay, so at this point, if I click on here the shortcut, which again takes you here, you can see what is linked. You can see who it's going to apply to. Say for instance I didn't want this GPO to apply to everyone. If that was the case, I would remove authenticated users and maybe put in a specific group here, like HR, or whatever group that I want it to apply to. I can put that group in here. So that's what the security filtering is for. And like we talked about previously, if we want to edit this, we can just right click on the policy itself, click edit. Notice that we have our computer configuration and user configuration that we talked about previously, and we can just go in and change whatever settings we want to on inside the group policy management editor. Okay, so still not had anyone join for the office hour, which is fine. It's given us a little time to kind of go over some of the basics here in chapter 3, but at this point that's about all I'm going to cover, and I'll at this point, we'll stop the recording and get this video posted up on YouTube for you.